Hey everybody, it's Joe Trippi, and welcome back to That Trippi Show with my co-host Alex Sashlow. Today we're continuing with our series, How Do We Get Here? Where do we go from here? And in a really unique way. In my book, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, and Alex points out that this book can legally drink now. That's how long ago I published it. I wrote about how one of the scariest things about technology and the technology revolution was that the tech can be used effectively and powerfully, whether it's being used by good or folks who have evil intent or unintended consequences that end up being evil. For example, the same social platform you use to keep up with your friends or what's happening in the world has an algorithm that has greatly contributed to both radicalizing and dividing our society. And tech has certainly had a corrosive effect on our democracies. How did we get here? Where do we go next? And how do we might be able to come back from the brink? We welcome a special guest, author of The Tech Coup, which I urge you to read. It's a must read. How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley, Marietje Schaake. Marietje is the International Policy Director at Stanford University Cyber Policy Center, former member of the European Parliament, and a columnist for the Financial Times. I can't think of a better voice on this issue, and her book, as I said, is a must-read. Marietje, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Alex, where do you want to get started?
Man, there is so much here, but I think we should really just start with the title. Marietje, you call basically what's been happening, and I would stretch it back past the last 5 years, a tech coup. You know, that kind of implies or suggests that there is some kind of takeover happening. How did we get to this point?
Well, for a long time, especially Americans, but I think, Europeans were guilty of this too. Was a real tendency to look at all the high potential, the upsides, the exciting things, the innovations that tech companies brought, and particularly those that were close to our daily lives. So, social media companies, search, stuff like that. And now with generative AI, it's a whole new wave of that kind of excitement that people see the marvel, they want to participate, and they don't really appreciate what the powers behind these platforms are, what their agendas are. So, for example, remember how we all got free email and that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And so, we were paying with our data. And I think to a large extent, we missed how quickly these platform companies vertically integrated, so started to embrace more and more functions, more and more power and influence in our lives without organizing countervailing powers, which I think is necessary in a rule of law-based democratic society, that when there's power, there's also a check on power, a check that's independent, a check that's based on transparency and accountability. And where we've landed is that more and more functions that used to be in the hands of public institutions, decisions made by publicly and democratically mandated leaders, are now in the hands of tech companies. And, thanks for reminding listeners that I wrote this book before Trump came into office for the second time, with the support of all these influential tech CEOs that are now basically his foot soldiers.
And how did at some point, the algorithms just started taking over. I mean, in a weird way, in a democracy, now the question is, who's in charge, the algorithms or us? And right now, it seems like it's the algorithms that are driving not just disinformation, but the division, this is all for profit. I mean, or is there a plan behind it to end democracy? I'm just sort of trying to get, where's the tech coup? What's the aim?
Well, so I think the algorithms have always been in charge, but the companies that run the algorithms have become increasingly more powerful and increasingly radicalized, I guess, for a number of powerful platforms. So, I made the case in discussions when I was still a member of European Parliament, where people said, as an argument against regulating social media companies, oh my gosh, in Europe especially, you have the worst memories of having a minister of truth, meaning we have to be careful for censorship, careful for governments telling what is acceptable and unacceptable speech. But I would reply and say, well, now Mark Zuckerberg is the minister of truth. And so we have always had a lot of autonomy, decision-making power given to the platforms that they used for commercial reasons, for political reasons, and everything in between. And there wasn't much scrutiny over that in the United States from the perspective of democracy. So, there's historically been a lot of trust in market forces, the online public square kind of thought in the United States, whereas, of course, the square was not public. And there was a lot of curation of information for all kinds of incentives. And I think what has changed over time and is very explicit now, where it was implicit before, is the political agendas of the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Elon Musks, and, the Sam Altmans of this world. And they are cheering on Donald Trump, who is assaulting democracy, certainly assaulting Europe. And so it's a very painful reckoning with a gradual process that is now sort of tipping over a very critical point.
Same with Starlink, and in the way now one Elon Musk can decide whether Ukraine gets to use it during the middle of a war. Not it's not a president of the United States. It's not some government making that decision. It's one man who's in control. I mean, that sort of makes your point, I think, about how it's not just that that democracy itself is under assault, like directly in terms of citizens and disinformation, but that power now that we're concentrating in each of these owners of the platform's hands is crossing borders. I mean, it's having more power in a lot of ways than a president does to make that decision, at least.
Exactly. So in my book, The Tech Coup, I make the point that we're dealing with a systemic problem. And so I think for a lot of listeners by now, the theme of technology and democracy is more familiar. They may think about disinformation as a problem, for example, right? Foreign interference, which was something that played a big role in the US as a public debate about interfering in the election. But it's much less obvious that through building infrastructure, controlling satellite connectivity, as you mentioned, as Elon Musk does, but also, building digital networks for the government, for example, scanning it for risk, offering cybersecurity products. Companies are at vital nodes of our societies in so many ways, with critical insights and critical decision-making power. And so I think it's a problem of both, political agendas that some of these CEOs have now made explicit that are not in line with, supporting the rule of law, rather creating parallel universes of power, whether it's through cryptocurrencies or through just more autonomy for companies without checks and balances. But it's also just a gradual process of outsourcing that governments have participated in. There was this whole narrative that if you're not a smart government, then you're sort of cheating your citizens, you're not offering the best services, you're sort of, stuck in the past century if you're not digitizing at, breakneck speed. And for a number of reasons, I think that was a narrow-minded narrative. But that narrative has also put these companies in the positions that they are. So I'm critical of the power hunger of tech CEOs, but I'm also very critical of democratic leaders, and D with a small, with a small d, meaning both parties in the United States, multiple political parties in Europe that have allowed this to happen.
So let's talk a little bit more about Europe, obviously, given your time in the European Parliament. And I want to get back to some of the arguments, like how regulation stifles innovation. I know you talk a lot about that, but looking at what has been done in Europe, just on a continental level, talking about like the Digital Services Act, I think you'd probably agree, good start, but the actual enforcement and the follow through hasn't really come through. What has Europe gotten right here, and like what can we learn from it?
Well, Europeans on the whole are much more sensitive to the notion that unchecked power is dangerous. This is because in not such long ago history, we had Nazism and communism, and there are also now new anti-democratic waves that keep people up at night. And so the idea that through technology, without checks and balances, you can actually abuse your position of power to spy on people, for example, or to manipulate information is something that Europeans are just much more aware of through their upbringings. I served in the European Parliament alongside people who had themselves resisted communism. Like they were, the opposition to communist governments in European countries. They paved the way for EU membership. So this is recent history in Europe that people are more aware of. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is actually, what's funny is that a lot of people in Silicon Valley kind of woke up to the power of Europe when it comes to regulation, when the General Data Protection Regulation was adopted. And that's, a privacy law. But the main goal of that law was not to hinder US tech companies, as the narrative might go in the Valley. It was to actually harmonize different laws across the EU. And so a lot of what the EU is still working on is integrating 27 different countries into one. And so you will also have legislative initiatives that are mainly there to overcome that fragmentation. And that is a whole different angle than what you might hear from tech lobbyists who say, oh my gosh, this is, a tool that is designed to go after us and our powers. And that is also born out of jealousy, for example, because European companies are not as big in the social media space and so on. So I think it's important to really appreciate the deeper motivations for protecting fundamental rights and integrating the market and the legal space, political space in Europe as a goal, aside from any specific policy issue.
I want to get sort of to, again, the people that are the mindset of some of the people that are doing that, building these. And it gets to, Mark Andreessen, who famously or infamously said that shape rotators build Skinner boxes and word cells live in them. And what he was saying was that these really smart, savvy tech guys are building the Skinner box, the place where the rats get addicted to hit, and learn how to hit the lever repeatedly to get more, and that the rest of us are living in that Skinner box that they've created. And so how do we climb out of that Skinner box? What do you or do you even agree that that's a fair reading of what some of these people think, that they're sort of smarter and can control us and actually realize that that's what they're doing?
Well, I think if you have mottos like move fast and break things, permissionless innovation, then you can definitely say that the idea of scaling, the notion of blitz scaling, the idea of capturing a market is the main goal. And so being faster than the competitor, look at the generative AI dynamics now, is a goal in and of itself. OpenAI released a ChatGPT and Google felt prompted to release its model, even if it felt like safety concerns were not properly dealt with. But because the competitor moved, they also moved. And so you can definitely see over and over again that there's a narrow lens on corporate success rather than a wide lens on societal success, the survival of democracy, and so on. And so what I focus on, it's not a surprise, I guess, after having been a public servant, elected representative, that I focus on the societal needs. And those require trade-offs, looking not just at the best case scenario for one actor, but really, the different impacts across the society. And I think that companies are just not incentivized to do that. They are incentivized to please investors, be faster than competition, sometimes even to deliberately turn a blind eye. Because then if somebody asks, oh, did you know, for example, that kids were getting addicted or that there were mental health issues, they can say, oh, no, we didn't know, because, they just didn't look, if you know what I mean.
Or they had no incentive to. So on that incentive note, and I, one of the common arguments that you hear basically right away from both big tech and now what's more concerning is a lot of their mouthpieces in government, as they've kind of wormed their way in, is that any attempt at regulation stifles the innovation or stifles the creativity or stifles the progress. Obviously, and you point out that in a lot of other really heavily regulated industries that's not the case. There's still innovation in medicine. There's still innovation in manufacturing, et cetera. So how do we bring those incentives back in line through the lens that any type of regulation immediately, in the eyes of at least the American public, has some real red flags on it?
Well, it may also be changing that perspective, because I think more and more Americans are seeing, the recklessness with which a couple of billionaires are gaining, but then a lot of others are losing out, whether it's when they're in communities confronted with hyperscale data centers where, water is being used, electricity is being used while it's very scarce, or whether it is social media that is really tearing communities apart, that is eroding the spaces where people can respectfully disagree, even come together to discuss anything at all. Young people, I know few parents that are happy with the addictive nature of mobile phones and all the apps on it. Now, of course, anyone who's in a university, whether as a student or teacher, has to reckon with generative AI and whether it's desirable for our evolution as people in thinking and concentrating and being accountable for the ideas we write down. So I hope that not all Americans think that regulation stifles innovation and that innovation is the highest goal. And I think it begins with challenging that, because ultimately that's not the case. Not even in the United States. In fact, Americans have historically wanted small government, maybe except for national security, when they were very happy to give a strong role to government, the military, police, law enforcement. So I don't think there's anyone who would say, well, society thrives when innovation is the top priority. But that's kind of the frame that these tech companies have successfully unleashed upon us. And it's become a mantra. It's become a mantra that as though any regulation stifles innovation. Whereas, frankly, if you're a government, you have multiple goals to achieve, not just to foster innovation, as important as that may be, but also to protect civil liberties, national security, to make sure that the budget, works, that there's not unintended consequences spilling over anything, from environmental harms to security issues or what have you. So I think it's just important to, again, see this sort of mantra in a broader context of what society needs and not just what a couple of billionaires would benefit from.
But one of the things that I find scary is that these companies now are wealthier than most countries, and their ability to operate across borders. And then when you add to that how it seems to also align with authoritarian impulses of leaders in different countries, it clearly is having a huge impact on society in terms of how democracies can survive this. How do we? Is it? Are there any realistic ways to rein in that kind of power, particularly, like I said, as it seems to be aligning with sort of the authoritarian impulses of some of the leaders in the world as well?
Well, that's for sure. And I think the big change and the big, crisis and disappointment from a democracy point of view has been the turn of the US administration against so many of the constitutional principles of the promise of the United States, and also of the need to actually have global cooperation on, for example, guardrails around AI. Here, the US is now an outlier. Every other country wants guardrails, rules, regulations around AI. In fact, not too long ago, it was CEOs of AI companies, the best AI researchers in the world, who were warning for safety concerns or just, loss of control or other kinds of undesirable impacts of AI that they otherwise have high hopes, of achieving societal benefit. And they basically said we need regulation. The US led regulation by setting up AI Safety Institute, participating with the UK government in that effort and so on, and has now stepped away from that. In fact, the federal government threatening states to have a moratorium of 10 years, is just something that sounds so utterly un-American to me, that I think Americans have many, many issues to tackle when it comes to erosion or assault on the rule of law. And of course, the tech layer is one of those. But I think one that's very powerful, because there are a lot of philosophers, investors, founders that have now started to support the idea that the democratic state needs to be replaced by some kind of startup model, right? That it's better for a CEO king kind of person to lead the country rather than a president and both houses of Congress and, the
technocracy.
judiciary. Yeah, technocracy. And I think what we may be facing, this is the hopeful version of what I think. I think we may be facing a delay in the impact of what is happening to really hit home for a lot of Americans. Or we may be facing a situation where people, and this is what I hear from a lot of my American contacts, are already so scared that while there's a lot of talk by Silicon Valley people as well and by the president that freedom of speech is so important, Europe is attacked for allegedly censoring. There is real consequence to speech on social media platforms, even retroactively. So if Europeans now want to apply for a visa, they have to submit their social media handles, and their opinions about this administration will be weighed towards whether they will be granted a visa. Of course, we've seen how tech companies are supporting the administration in identifying targets when students have written about the Gaza genocide, for example, and are being picked off the streets by plainclothes officers brought to secret detention facilities. I mean, what is happening in America? What is happening in America? Where are Americans in standing up for, these core freedoms that nobody, whether it's a tech bro or someone else, should take from them, and certainly not the president? So, I'm worried that Americans have already become sort of paralyzed with concern that they can't, what Marietje Schaake, really hits home very well, hold the line. So Marietje Schaake, the American Filipino journalist who is incredibly courageous, won a Nobel Prize for it, says basically, hold the line. You have to fight every inch that they want to take away from you, that an authoritarian regime tries to take. And frankly, I don't think that's the mindset that the bulk of Americans are in right now.
No, and you get to things like, this gets to Jimmy Kimmel being pulled off the air. This gets to all the settlements that both law firms and media organizations are having with Trump. They're making the capitalist risk assessment. This is our best way to continue making money or staying on the air or whatever the case may be. But the administration is viewing it as taking that next step, clawing something else away, and then looking for, it feels a little bit like they're the frog in the boiling water, but they don't realize that the temperature has been turned up dramatically yet.
But even, from an outsider, on the one hand, so much trust in markets. On the other hand, direct intervention from the government in companies when companies don't do what the administration wants, or when they hire someone that Trump wants to take revenge over, or forcing a sale of TikTok to a befriended CEO. I've tried to imagine, Joe, maybe you could speak to this. What would Republicans do if these steps would have been taken by Democrats? They would have cried communism a long time ago, right? This is so fundamentally against what I believe Republicans ultimately want as a society. So how can this happen? Even if it's only looked at through an economic lens, which I'm, not in favor of, because I think opting for the economic aspects against the broader issues of democracy is a bad thing. But I'm just so shocked that people are just apparently tolerating this.
Well, I two things. One is I think no. To answer the question, the Democrat leader would be impeached or definitely in a trial right now for the same things that are going on today. And then. But I do think that part of it is the technology, the social networks, the fragmentation of information that literally so many Americans are living in the Fox or X bubble, whatever you want to, however you want to put it. But the one thing I would say is I think with the troops being sent into American cities, you are starting to see, a wake up, if you will. A more verbal, more tougher response in Illinois, California, Maryland, in the states where he's sending in the troops and people peacefully protesting is growing in size. So that's part of this, I think, is how do we create maybe a pro-democracy movement across citizens in democracies or people who support democracy across the globe. I know that you'd been talked about declaration on the future of the internet as a possible framework for cooperating across democracies. How do we what would it take to turn something like that into real action? And what role could the U.S. and Europe play in leading that effort, or people like us out there could help build?
Well, I think it's crucial that Americans who don't appreciate what they're seeing, keep supporting media organizations that are, respecting journalistic integrity, that they keep supporting civil society organizations, because a lot of the resources towards civil society that, defended democracy, whether in the US or elsewhere, has now been dried up. And so the need is greater, the resources are fewer. And, anything around collaborating on a framework for rule of law respecting internet without the US is a whole lot harder. So when I recommended that this could be a basis for international collaboration, that was assuming that the US would continue to support rules-based order, including online, and it hasn't. So I do think Americans should seek out, organizations that have this global outlook already. There are so many, whether it's human rights organizations, digital rights organizations, women's rights organizations, labor unions, minority rights organizations. It's important indeed that these organizations survive, but also that they work together more efficiently. And what tends to happen under pressure is, of course, more competition, and that's not always helpful. So I think getting involved, whether it's locally or through an organization that operates nationally and internationally, is something that any American, if they have the means, which of course, it's a privilege, it would be really good to double down on and to really not only contribute, but get involved.
Yeah, you make the case that all of this ultimately comes down to protecting democracy itself, I think. And, but with how AI is now shaping elections, fueling even more disinformation, expanding surveillance, what should democratic governments be doing now to prevent the next phase of the tech coup?
Well, if I look at it from an EU perspective, there has been a lot of focus on regulation, and I think there's a role for regulation, meaning, to protect fundamental rights, to make sure that there's fairness in the economy, to make sure that there's not an onboarding of more risk for crime or national security threats through the use of technology. But it's also vital that there are alternative ecosystems built. So Europeans need to now double down on investing in building different kind of tech to be less dependent on foreign, mostly American technologies that can be weaponized and instrumentalized for either economic competition or geopolitical competition or what have you. And I think, it's been pretty clear which CEOs support this president, but it doesn't matter ultimately, because the executive in the US is so powerful that through adopting sanctions, they can really turn companies against even markets that are really important for them. So I actually think that the tech companies that are supporting this president have taken a huge gamble, and I hope that they will pay a price at some point. And I think these companies are now so big that it's not difficult for them to navigate through regulations, but it will be harder when there are alternative tech companies that are simply going to compete with them, and that people will be inclined to trust more because they fall under European or other jurisdictions. So I would say build, build, build.
Yeah, well, as you know, I've been trying to create a social network, pro-democracy social network called SEZ.us, and we're now looking at basing in Europe to not to work under those regulations and work with people there to actually create a better kind of network that's not driven by the same algorithms and the same greed that the current and grasp for power as most of the incumbent firms are doing. We're running out of time, but I wanted to, and actually Alex asked us, if you can imagine a healthy digital democracy 10 years from now, what's that look like to you? What do you see if we could change this for the better?
Talk our listeners off the ledge a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, it would look less concentrated, so more players for people to choose from, and more companies that are choosing to, well, first of all, respect the law, the rule of law, support democracy, and actually see it as something that is good for them rather than something that needs to be fought and lobbied against. But also to have more demands for transparency and accountability of any tech that we use. It doesn't matter what company builds it, where the company is from, but really, the lack of transparency that we have now into how, whether it's algorithms or other AI applications or, retail platforms, social media networks, search, so many of the technologies that we've come to rely on for so many parts of our lives are not to be scrutinized independently. So, at Stanford, we have a lot of researchers who are the best minds when it comes to AI, but they can only gain access to the latest models and compute of a certain caliber, LLMs, when they work with companies. So there are no public interest alternatives even to develop knowledge, for example, in academic institutions. And I just think that that's ultimately a very unhealthy situation. And so, part of what the focus is in Europe right now is to make sure that that capacity is built and that it's much more public interest tech rather than corporate interest tech. And I think, I just want to be clear that I'm still very excited about the potential of technology, but I just do not appreciate so much power without checks on it, without countervailing powers. And so I think there are many, many roads to success in technology, and success should be defined as success for everyone, not just for the wealthy few on the top.
Thanks, Marietje, for coming on, and thanks everyone for listening to That Trippi Show. We'll include a link to the Tech Coup in our show notes. Make sure you join us at sez.us. It's a civil social network for real human beings. And this podcast will be free and is part of Lincoln Square, so check out the latest at lincolnsquare.media. You can always send us a question to thattrippishow@gmail.com or leave us a question and a review on iTunes. We'll see you next week. Thanks, Marietje.
Thank you so much. It was great to discuss with you.